So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll be starting in about 30 seconds. We're just going to wait for folks to trickle on in from the waiting room. And as we do that, for those who are comfortable doing so, certainly no obligation, don't feel pressure, but if you're comfortable doing so, let us know in the chat where you're joining us from this afternoon. So if you're comfortable doing so, type in where you're watching us from this afternoon in the chat. And we will get started in about 15 seconds. North Andover, wonderful. Andover, wonderful. Wilmington, wonderful. We're not starting until someone types in Tewksbury. Okay, there we go, Patricia. A few folks from out of state. That's always nice to see. That's the fun thing about these Zooms. I'll give it another 10 seconds or so. Even though we're in Zoom webinar and the cameras can only see Allison and I do need to notify folks that I am recording today's presentation, so just be aware of that. If you have any questions or comments for Allison, you can type them into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the very end after Allison's presentation. Also wanted to note that sometime tomorrow, those who registered will be receiving an email from me. Please click on the feedback link in that feedback survey link in that email. Let us know what you thought of today's event and what you'd like to see for future events from the Tewksbury Library. And I will also share that along with the partnering libraries. And so speaking of partnering libraries, where are we here? So this event is co-sponsored by the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library, and it is presented in collaboration with the Memorial Hall Library in Andover, the Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover, and I think the Wilmington Memorial Library in Wilmington jumped on board late as well. So let's see. I was expecting a few more folks, but I think out of respect for those that came on time, we will get started. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Allison. The presentation is entitled Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement. For as long as women have battled for equitable political representation in America, those battles have been defined by images, whether illustrations, engravings, photographs, or colorful it's too early for me, chromolithograph posters. Some of these pictures have been flattering and many have been condescending, and others downright incendiary. They have drawn upon prevailing cultural ideas of women's perceived roles and abilities, and often have been circulated with pointedly political objectives. We're going to take a look at the ways in which women's rights activists and their opponents used images to define gender and power during the women's suffrage movement. And so this afternoon, the lecture will be presented by Allison K. Lange, who's an assistant professor of history at Wentworth Institute of Technology. She's also the author of Picturing Political Power, Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement. She has worked with the National Women's History Museum and curated exhibitions from the Boston Public Library's Leventhal Map Center, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and Harvard's Schlesinger Library. Allison has presented her work at conferences of the American Historical Association and Organization of American Historians. And her writing has appeared in many places, including the Atlantic and the Washington Post. So all of us watching live on Zoom and those that will watch on demand on YouTube, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Allison for joining us this afternoon. And Allison, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and thank you for organizing this event today. I'm delighted to be here to speak with all of you about the women's voting rights movement and the fascinating images that we're going to be looking at today, especially on this gorgeous sunny day. I know how valuable these early spring days are to us. So I'm thrilled to chat with all of you today at the end of the closing moments of our Women's History Month. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Everyone should be able to hopefully see that at this point. And I'm going to start actually by thinking about the ways that we think about the women's voting rights movement today. So when you think of the women's voting rights movement, what are some of the things I want you to think about? What are some of the people that come to mind? What are some of the important events? Or maybe you don't even know that much about it, which is perfectly fine too. A lot of the images and a lot of the people who were important leaders of that movement are still really part of our popular culture and our political culture, our protest culture, even in the 21st century. And so I'm going to start off thinking about the ways that their imagery still influences us today. So the first image that I want us to think about is this one here, which is from the 2017 Women's March in Washington, D.C. This is down Pennsylvania Avenue, and some of you might immediately recognize that someone has created a poster, a big sign, or many different signs rather, with a lot of different important women in American history. We see Eleanor Roosevelt, we see Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but in the very front with the glasses on, we see Susan B. Anthony. And Susan B. Anthony, as you probably already know, is one of the most famous suffragists. And one of the things that we're going to think about today is how she became one of the most famous suffragists. It certainly was not by accident, and it was certainly something that she worked very hard at, so that today, over a century after her death, we would still know who she is and what she did. And this is actually from a century before that Women's March in 2017. This is from the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. This was the very first suffrage parade in the nation's capital. Women had never marched down Pennsylvania Avenue before. And this is a photograph of Inez Milholland. Inez Milholland marched at the very front of the parade on this elegant white horse. And she was a very famous suffragist in the 1910s. She was considered to be the most beautiful suffragist, so she was a very popular suffragist to have, for their public image. But she was also incredibly talented and smart. She was one of the few women who attended law school, and she attended at New York University, which was one of the few schools that allowed women to study law at that time. And one of the reasons why I'm showing you this photograph, which, as I said, occurred exactly on the same street that the Women's March did over a century later, is because it reminded me so much this past summer of this photograph that became incredibly popular in summer 2020 with regard to the Black Lives Matter movement. You can see the similarities, they're pretty apparent. Both photographs were incredibly popular in the moment around these protests. And there's something about these women who are nobly, kind of elegantly riding on these horses that creates a really compelling photograph that it draws the public's attention in a significant way, not only to the individuals, but also to the causes that these two women represent. In fact, this photograph became so famous this past summer that Xfinity actually decided to integrate Brianna Noble, who is the woman in this still actually from an advertisement, into this campaign. So here she's not only kind of signaling this brand's political stance, but also selling a product here. Another thing that the suffragists did, which you may be surprised to learn, is that they were the very first group to picket the White House. And they did that in 1917. And if you've been to Washington, D.C. in the last, several decades, you've probably almost always seen picketers outside the White House, someone protesting something, someone with a poster of some kind. But the suffragists were really the first group to ever do that. It was incredibly controversial. And so one of the things that also stood out to me is the ways that we still think about this space around the White House as an incredibly central space for political protest. And I'm sure you all remember this past summer again, when we had Black Lives Matter written on the streets here. So this is a reminder that this space around the White House continues to be a really important, crucial, vital, like vibrant center for political conversations over a century after the suffragists really made it that way. The other thing you might have been noticing in these last several years are these images of women in public political positions wearing white, maybe also wearing a yellow rose. But the yellow rose also signifies suffrage, but one of the reasons why they're wearing white is also to remind us of the suffragists. As you might remember, Inez Milholland was wearing white in her photograph here from the 1913 parade. Suffragists wore white at the parades because it helped them stand out in black and white photographs. So in a photograph where you have like various shades of gray, maybe a dark road, just kind of like not a color photograph, wearing white really helped them stand out. So one of their goals was, when these photographs were printed in newspapers, was that people could actually see them and see how many of them were there. And so a century later, that's not really necessary with color photography in the same way. And yet this color, this type of clothing, is still part of our public conversations about, women's voting rights. And this is something that, even, in the last several years, we've seen a lot of this kind of representation of wearing white, as I'm sure some of you have already seen. And so you might be surprised to see where we're going next here. We just thought a lot about 21st century images related to suffrage, and I'm going to take us back very, very far to the 18th century, which might be a little bit earlier than you might have expected. But the reason why we're going to start there is because a lot of the political conversations and representations of women that the suffragists were dealing with were established long before the suffrage movement actually began. So the first image that I would like to have us look at here is by Philip Daw. And he was a British artist, and this is from 1775. And just so you know, just to remind us, 1775 is the year before the Declaration of Independence. There's rebellion happening in the colonies. People are boycotting tea. People are creating petitions and things, but we're not quite at the point of a full-out war. So Philip Daw is in London. He's reading about this group of women in Edenton, North Carolina, who have suddenly decided to boycott tea, and they're signing a petition to boycott tea. Philip Daw has never been to North Carolina before. He's never met these women. He's probably only read just like a brief article about it. But he decides anyway that he needs to create an image of this scene. And when we look at this scene, we can see that it's not really a positive image of these women, right? So there's a woman with a gavel. She has a very large nose, very masculine features. There's another woman in the background. If any of you have been to the Museum of Fine Arts, you've probably seen in the American wing the very large silver punch bowl that was created by Paul Revere. And if you know anything about the 18th century, you probably also know that that was not intended just for like fruit punch. That was an alcoholic punch. And the woman in the background holding the big bowl to her lips is drinking alcohol at this petition signing. And there's a woman actually standing right next to her who's lifting up the bowl even higher, right? So encouraging her to drink more. The women are all ignoring the child who is sitting underneath the table. So the only thing paying attention to the child in this picture is a dog who is also urinating on a couple of tea canisters, which is like a shockingly common theme in a lot of cartoons from the Revolutionary period. So this image, this political cartoon, is intending to suggest that if women participate in politics, they will abandon their duties, their responsibilities as mothers and as wives. They're going to be challenging social roles. The cartoon is also suggesting that we don't take them seriously, right? This is intended for people to laugh at these women and not take their interest with any seriousness. The other thing I want to notice is that there's a Black woman behind the woman with the gavel, and she's looking over this woman's shoulder. She's also carrying a quill and an inkwell. And she even looks eager to sign this petition, to join this political rebellion. And I want to remind us, this is North Carolina, 1775. She's probably intended to represent an enslaved woman. And Philip Dahl likely included her to suggest that if women were allowed to participate in politics, the next thing is that Black Americans, particularly women, will also want to participate in politics. So not only is this political cartoon suggesting that women, white women, are challenging the patriarchy, challenging male dominance and male supremacy in colonial British society, but also this entire group might also be challenging white supremacy, the racial hierarchy, as well as the very profitable for the British Empire system of slavery. So the idea here in this image, and many others like it, as you will soon see, is that if women participate in politics, they are going to transform, challenge, and really harm society. So this is from 1851, so 75 years later about. And if you know anything about the women's voting rights movement, you probably know that by the mid-19th century, 1848, we've got the Seneca Falls Convention in New York when they draft the Declaration of Sentiments. So when they start listing off the rights that women want. In 1850, we have the very first National Women's Rights Convention, which actually happened very nearby in Worcester. And so by 1851, the women's rights movement is receiving a lot of press attention. People are, on the whole, very aware of it, and they have very strong feelings about it. And you can tell that this artist has incredibly similar feelings about it that Philip Dahl did 75 years earlier. So we see a woman in the center of the scene. She is smoking, which is not something that women are supposed to be doing. She's also wearing bloomers and showing off her ankle, which might not seem like a very scandalous thing to us today, but I guarantee you 1851, showing off her ankles is a big deal. She also has her hand placed fairly condescendingly, I think, on this man who's hunched over, sitting next to her, mending clothing, doing this menial labor. And in front of both of them, there's a child who is crying. And he actually is holding a banner saying, "No more Papa and Mama." And this is all to suggest that the mother is, ignoring her child, not taking care of her motherly and wifely duties in the home. In the background, we have two women who are protesting also. There's one white woman who has a banner saying "No more basement and kitchen." So she's challenging the class hierarchy. She's probably intended to represent a domestic servant who does not want to do this domestic labor anymore. We also have a Black woman who is protesting slavery. And note that this Black woman is not only protesting slavery, she's also smoking a cigar while she does it. And they're wearing bloomers, which all of this puts this scene into a place where in 1851, if Americans are going to go look at it, they're going to be laughing at this. They are going to be mocking these suffragists. It also, however, represents their anxiety about how America might change if women do gain new rights. And just to emphasize how popular these images are, I'm going to show you a couple more from the same time period. This is kind of like the equivalent of like a 21st century like meme on social media. This is the kind of image that you would have seen a version of, even if it's in Harper's New Monthly magazine like this one, or a different magazine, or a print in a local office or a local coffee shop and that sort of thing. So this is the kind of image that people were seeing regularly. This is called Women's Emancipation, also from 1851. We also see women wearing bloomers, but just note that the skirts on these bloomers are incredibly short. In fact, in reality, the bloomers that women wore had skirts that usually went down to their ankles. So this is very, very, very scandalous. We have women smoking, holding riding crops. Even the dog, the bulldog, is like a very aggressive looking dog. We also have a suggestion with these two women who have their backs facing us. We have them arm in arm linked, and with this suggestion that these women are not only kind of advocating for rights, they are interested in the company of other women and perhaps not even interested in the company of other men. This kind of suggestion of the association with the women's rights movement with homosexuality was very common, and suffragists worked very hard, as we will see, to suggest that women's rights activists were not lesbians, and that they were in fact wives and mothers. Even though a century later or so, scholars have done a lot of research to find the relationships that many of these women actually did have with each other. So this is 1869, 100 years, right around 100 years after that first historical image that I showed you. This is called the Age of Brass, or the Triumphs of Women's Rights. And it shows a group of women who are off to cast their ballots. And we have a lot of similar themes here. Some women wearing masculine looking clothes, other women just wearing very outlandish clothes, a woman smoking a cigar, and one of my favorite themes in these 19th century images, a man carrying a baby, which was basically intended to represent, the end of the world, that these women had truly abandoned their responsibilities. And in fact, men were becoming more feminine as a result of that. We have this woman next to him, presumably his wife, like raising her fist at him and telling him he needs to take care of the child. And he has this incredibly appalled, terrified look on his face. In the center, we have this wonderful sign which says, "Vote for the celebrated man tamer, Susan Sharptongue," which just says a lot about how people envisioned women in politics in 1869. So you can imagine by the 1860s why women's rights activists wanted to change the conversation and show themselves, represent themselves to the public a little bit differently. You might be familiar with these three figures. Sojourner Truth is on the left, and she was born in the late 1790s in New York. She was born enslaved, and she was able to free herself when she was about 30 years old. And she went on to become a very famous women's rights activist and anti-slavery activist, well into the final years of her life. She was unable to read or write, but she worked with another anti-slavery activist to write the story of her life, which she published very soon after Frederick Douglass published his. And then by the 1850s, there was a new type of technology called the wet plate process. And that allowed for the reproduction of photographs very cheaply. And that led to the popularity of these carte de visite photographs, which are the photographs that you see on this screen. They're very small in real life. You've probably seen them at an exhibit before. They're about the size of like a baseball card. And people would collect them, share them with friends, put them in scrapbooks. You wanted one of your favorite actor and writer and the president of the day, right? Because you couldn't just Google what they looked like. This was kind of your way of creating the world around you in an album of your choice. So Sojourner Truth decided to sell these photographs. She decided to sell them to raise money for herself and to raise money for her causes. So she was basically a professional reformer. And it says at the bottom of the card here, it says, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." And in the 19th century, in a time when people were making photographs using sunlight, shadow was a popular nickname for photographs. And so she was selling this photograph to support the substance, which was herself and her very substantial ideas that she was promoting. And in this photograph, you can see that Sojourner Truth does not want to look anything like the stereotypes that we've been looking at in the last several cartoons. In fact, she's challenging them pretty significantly here. She has knitting in her hand. She has very conservative, matronly, feminine clothing on with this shawl. And she has this head wrap on as well, really emphasizing that she's a working woman. She's also in this scene kind of like looking like a domestic setting, right? She's got a table with a tablecloth and a book and this vase of flowers. really trying to emphasize here that she's a respectable woman, that she's a feminine woman, and that she's very capable of these very traditionally female associated with tasks. And so she is trying to not only challenge these stereotypes about women's rights activists, but as you know, she's also trying to challenge stereotypes that were, racist stereotypes of Black people in the 19th century too. So she has these two kinds of ways of using her image in mind. In contrast, or similarly in some ways, soon after Sojourner Truth starts distributing her portraits, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony decide that that's a great idea and maybe they should also sit for a portrait and distribute it. So Anthony is with brown hair. Elizabeth Cady Stanton has white hair here. She was very famous for her white curls that, people at the time said made her look like Martha Washington. And they decided to sit for this photograph in 1870. And so they have a very different, a very similar idea in that they want to challenge these negative representations of women's rights leaders, but they're representing themselves a little bit differently. They make no pretense that they're in like a domestic space. They look like they are working hard. They've got a book right in front of them that is open. And even just their pose really emphasizes that they are assertive, that they are not interested in your opinions, that they are going to become the leaders of this movement. And so these images really helped make the faces of suffragists more familiar to the general public and helped kind of complicate the narrative that people were seeing in popular images. However, that's not to say that cartoonists stopped creating political cartoons of these suffragists. So this is from 1873. 3 years after that first photograph, we've got Susan B. Anthony, hand on her hip, umbrella in hand. And we have her, in this scene. And you can see very easily that this artist actually directly copied that 1870 photograph. So a few things to point out that'll remind us of our previous images that we looked at. We've got this women's political rally happening in the background. And if you know anything about the women's rights movement of the 1870s, they are not having political rallies, political protests like this. There's a female police officer, and there's also two men doing women's domestic tasks. One is holding a baby, and the other one looks like he's doing the day's groceries. He's got a basket in hand. In the center of the scene, we have an unflattering image of Susan B. Anthony, right? So her skirt is too short, and it actually shows us some very masculine looking boots that actually have spurs on them. The other thing that is intended to kind of further emphasize this unflattering representation is that Susan B. Anthony actually had an eye issue in her right eye. And that's one of the reasons why we often see her pictured in profile. And you can see that the artist here in this zoomed in version actually represented that eye issue in this political cartoon. So you can see that this artist is not being kind to her at all. But the suffragists still want to be represented as prominent political figures. You've probably seen, a million versions of portraits like these of presidents, of elite white men demonstrating that they are in power in the United States. Whether it's at a university or even at your local library or at a museum. These kinds of images are popular now, and they were very popular then. And suffragists really wanted to look more like them. So in 1881, Stanton, Anthony, and their colleague Matilda Jocelyn Gage actually created a brand new project to try and tell a new story about the women's suffrage movement. And it was called The History of Women's Suffrage. It was first published in 1881, and it eventually became a series of 6 volumes of suffrage history. Each volume has 1,000 pages in it, so it's quite extensive. And they decided which story to tell. They decided whose portraits to include, and they really shaped the story that we still are most familiar with today. So they really centered themselves at the rise of the women's voting rights movement, which is one of the reasons why their names are still the ones that are so familiar. So they obviously included portraits of themselves, which are the ones you see here right now. But they also did not include any of men. Men were crucial, advocates of women's voting rights. They were the ones holding office at the time. You needed them as allies. They did not include any representations of women of color, even though Sojourner Truth worked with them regularly, even though they certainly had a photograph of Sojourner Truth that they could have included. And so they also did not include, they include minimally, Lucy Stone and her American Women's Suffrage Association, which if you know much about our local women's rights history in Massachusetts, you know that Lucy Stone was running a competing suffrage organization that was actually far larger and far more successful than Anthony and Stanton's organization at this time. However, you wouldn't know that. Probably many of us haven't heard of Lucy Stone before, but I would argue that in the 1880s, her organization is dramatically more important for sure. And yet, all through this time, these political cartoons or these stereotypical images of women's voting rights activists are staying thematically similar, even if they are shifting from being engravings to stereo cards like this one. Perhaps you've seen these before, these double photograph cards. If you put them in a device called a stereoscope, you can actually see them as three-dimensional. They're a very popular parlor game. So we've got this woman reading newspaper. She's wearing bloomers. There's a bike kind of, blocking her from presumably her husband in the back. And her husband in the back is responsible for doing laundry. So very much similar ideas to even the cartoon from 1775, right? We've got these swapped gender roles. And so suffragists actually decided to change their opinion and change their visual propaganda rather. And they decided to directly counter the political cartoons that had been so popular for so many years. And they did that by creating a new kind of imagery, particularly in the early 20th century, that really emphasized that women really needed the vote because they were good mothers and good wives. So no longer really emphasizing this idea of equality, more emphasizing that because they were mothers and supposedly more moral, that they needed the right to vote. This image is by a local Massachusetts artist, Blanche Ames. It's called Double the Power of the Home. Two good votes are better than one, from 1915. And you can see that this is a very idyllic scene, right? This looks nothing like any of the images of female voting rights activists that we've seen previously. She is, surrounded by her three children. She has a God bless our home sign in the back. She has a tea kettle on the stove steaming away. This is just, a perfect home according to what the suffragists envisioned. One of the things to emphasize here is that they are challenging this stereotype of suffragists as masculine women who wanted to abandon their families, but they're also creating a particular image that emphasizes women who are able to afford to stay at home, women who are able to choose not to work, so fairly wealthier women. They're also emphasizing white women who are more likely to have the privilege of kind of staying home with their children rather than being required to work. So it's a very particular vision of who a good voter is. This is another example of this kind of imagery from this time period by Rose O'Neill, who you might recognize her design if you're familiar with Cupid dolls from the period. It says, "Give mother the vote, we need it." So we have babies marching in favor of mothers making decisions about their food, their health, their play, their homes, their schools, their work. So by the 1910s, suffrage imagery is changing pretty significantly. They're going in the popular mainstream media. They're going from being represented as these frumpy women to being represented as these very fashionable women with this lovely hat and lovely ribbon with the women's suffrage banner on it, right? And this is a representation of suffragists that really reminds us more of the idealized types representing women at the time, right? So these young, highly educated white women were the ideal, and they're starting to kind of resemble the suffrage ideal too. But as we said, as we just mentioned, this is, an image, a propaganda image that leaves a lot of people out. This is Mary Church Terrell, and she was born enslaved in 1863. She eventually became one of the first Black women in the United States to earn both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. And she became the first president of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. And that organization fought for women's voting rights, but it also fought for Black men's voting rights. As you know, by the 1890s, literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all of these new pieces of legislation are preventing Black men from voting. And so the National Association of Colored Women is a more expansive organization. It's looking at more than just voting rights for women. It's looking at improving education for their children, creating community centers for Black communities. And so one of the things to note here is that Mary Church Terrell was very interested in public images as well. And you can see, even just from this one portrait of her, that she's a very wealthy woman, very interested in fashion, and she wants you to respect her. She very much wants to portray herself as a refined, very elegant woman. And in fact, her portraits of herself that we see in her promotional materials, like this bulletin from one of her talks, really resembles this idealized and so-called new Negro type from 1904. So we can see the similarities here, the elegant dress, the way her hair is done, etc. So while all of the images I've shown you so far were very popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, this is the one image that is very unusual. This is the only image in my many years of working on this project that I have found that represents Black women as needing the right to vote because they are good mothers. So we've got a Black woman holding a bat that says Federal Constitution, and she's beating down segregation, Jim Crow laws, grandfather clauses in order to protect the 2 children in her skirts. So this is a representation of what votes for women means for the South, as it says on the bottom. So the idea here is that a lot of Southern states don't want Black women to vote because they know that they will become powerful opponents of segregation and Jim Crow laws, etc. And the thing that I want to kind of really emphasize is that the mainstream, the white women-led suffrage organizations really did not choose to emphasize that women of color wanted voting rights. And so an organization like the National Association of Colored Women and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, those organizations were the ones that were more likely to be creating imagery like this. The other type of pictures that became popular, especially in the 1910s, were images of suffragists protesting. And this is actually a postcard, and there were plenty of photographs kind of reproduced in newspapers and magazines. This is from that 1913 parade that we discussed at the beginning when we were thinking about Inez Milholland on her horse. This is that exact parade here. This is also a representation of the Herald, kind of this idealized scene. And the next image I'm going to show you is a racist cartoon to give you a sense of why someone like Terrell was working so hard to represent herself as elegant and refined. And this is it. It's from 1913. It's from the suffrage parade moment. And it's this moment when white suffragists do not want Black suffragists to march with them. And so we see that represented here by the white woman who is jumping back because these 3 Black women want to march with them in their parade. You can see that they're not represented kindly. Their features are over exaggerated. They're wearing unfashionable clothing. This is all intended to mock the white suffragists for not wanting fellow supporters to march with them, but also mock the Black suffragists. Ultimately, Mary Church Terrell did actually march in this 1913 suffrage parade. So did Ida B. Wells and an entire group of a sorority from Howard University's Delta Sigma Theta. So Black women did march throughout the parade despite that early controversy about women of color marching at all. The other really important protest that we should note that there are amazing photographs of, and quite frankly, these are the photographs that brought me to this project originally, were these pickets of the White House from 1917. You know, as I said, this is a new type of protest. Women had never done such a thing before. No one had ever done such a thing before. And they were really intriguing. And this is a moment when photojournalism is a new profession, and people are able to send images via telegraph across the country overnight so that newspapers anywhere in the country can print these photographs in their newspaper the next day. So this becomes a really controversial scene because, as you know, suffragists start picketing the White House in January 1917. The other thing that happens in January 1917 is that the United States decides to enter World War I. And this becomes, it becomes questionable. People really wonder, should these suffragists be protesting during a time when the nation is at war? And so over time, while these suffragists protest, they eventually are arrested for blocking the sidewalk. You can see it's a very broad sidewalk. Nonetheless, they're arrested for blocking the sidewalk, and they are put into a workhouse in Virginia, and they ultimately go on hunger strikes there, and they are eventually force fed. So this becomes, this really makes the presidential administration, Woodrow Wilson's administration, and the local DC police, makes them look really bad. This gains a lot of negative press to the officials, but it also gains a lot of positive press for the suffragists in some ways because it keeps the issue in the news. So while one component of suffragists are picketing the White House, the other component of suffragists, in fact, maybe the majority of suffragists, decide to support the war effort in other ways. And for example, they become nurses, like we see in this poster here. So suffragists are deploying overseas as nurses. They are becoming farmers at home, trying to create crops. They are joining industry, becoming factory workers, all to support the war effort. And while these suffrage picketers are standing outside Woodrow Wilson's front door, reminding him daily to think about women's voting rights, these suffragists who are offering a more moderate, more conservative viewpoint offer him the kind of arguments, the kind of rhetoric that he ultimately adopts when he finally declares his support for suffrage to Congress in 1918. He decides to make the case, and many others follow his lead, that women deserve to vote because they are good mothers, because they are virtuous citizens, because they've demonstrated their support for the war effort. And so that is the kind of the main reasoning that Woodrow Wilson uses to promote women's voting rights. And many other politicians follow his lead with that argument. However, we know that he got that argument from the many suffragists who had been developing that and making that a popular kind of rhetoric for many years, not only with speeches and writings, but also with the images that we were looking at today. So if you're interested, you can certainly check out more of my book, which has a code here if you buy it through the University of Chicago Press website, UCP New. And otherwise, I'm thrilled to answer any questions that you have. I'm happy to go back to other slides and talk about any particular questions you have.
So Allison, thank you so much for that presentation. That was excellent, as expected. So if anyone on the line has a question or comment for Allison, they can either type it into the chat or the Q&A, and I'll make sure to relay it to Allison. Francis says, excellent presentation. I agree.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Allison, while we're waiting for a few questions, hopefully, let me ask you, writing the book, doing years of research, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about these women?
I think one of the most surprising things that I learned was just how much they shaped the narrative about suffrage that we still have today. For example, I mentioned the work that Susan B. Anthony did to make sure that she was the most famous suffragist we still have, I would argue, in 2021. And I think it's really interesting to see the ways that, on the one hand, it's amazing to see how much work they did in order to make themselves known. And it's amazing to see how ridiculed they were then in comparison to how much they are heroines now in the 21st century. And yet it's also really complicated to look at them and realize that they really ignored women like Sojourner Truth or Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Mary Church Terrell, all of these women of color who were really important advocates in the women's voting rights movement. But, quite frankly, a lot of people don't know about them today. And one of the reasons why is simply because they were written out of histories like that history of women's suffrage that I mentioned. They're literally written out of stories like that, which makes them much harder to find. So I think that we're changing that slowly. I think that, if you've had an opportunity to do things like watch the new PBS documentary, The Vote, or listen to the really cool podcast that the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission put out called, oh my goodness, I'm gonna blank on the name, but it has Greta and Rosario Dawson in it. It's like this great, more complicated telling of women's suffrage stories than we probably got in our high school textbooks, which, as we might remember, often those high school textbooks say something like, and then women were granted the right to vote, very little acknowledgement of the very real work that women had done for many years.
Jane also says that this was an excellent presentation. Betty says, thank you, great presentation with a lot of information that I never knew. Francis would like to know, what are your thoughts? Do you think women would have gotten the vote if World War I had not occurred?
I think that's a excellent question, a really fascinating question. I mean, obviously as a historian, I'm not like someone to play the alternate reality card. But I do think that it's really important to think about the ways that World War I was so crucial in women getting the right to vote. Suffragists really were strategic about demonstrating their use. And one of the reasons why is because for many generations, one of the arguments against women's voting rights was that women didn't participate in the military. Therefore, they didn't kind of earn the right to vote. But by showing that they were participating as patriotic citizens, as nurses and factory workers, etc., they were able to prove their value. The other thing that I do wonder, especially in the light of our own pandemic, is women also kind of proved themselves as vital community caregivers during the 1918 flu crisis. One of the things that suffrage historians really make a big deal about is the fact that Woodrow Wilson delivered his speech in favor of women's voting rights in 1918, in the fall of 1918. Within the week after he delivers that speech, actually Washington, D.C. is pretty much shut down by the flu pandemic. The House of Representatives is closed off. And we, in 2021 have a sense of what that could have looked like, maybe more than we would have, 5 years ago when we were learning about this. So there's always a big deal made about how Woodrow Wilson made this speech in October, but the 19th Amendment didn't pass until the following spring. But I think we can, in 2021, have a better sense of how a pandemic like that would have disrupted a lot of conversations like those about women's voting rights. So I do wonder, even if we hadn't had World War I, and I realize World War I played a significant role in spreading the flu pandemic, I wonder if something like the flu pandemic would have also kind of demonstrated that women played these vital roles in their communities, whether as officially, professionally trained nurses, or as more informal caregivers for families, friends, and relatives. I think that it was really the combination of World War II and the pandemic that really solidified women's status and support for the 19th Amendment. The other thing I'd love to just kind of note with regard to that is that not all women gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment actually prohibits voter discrimination based on sex. And so it does not guarantee women the right to vote. A lot of women, for example, those who were subject to literacy tests in various states or poll taxes, they were unable to vote even after the 19th Amendment passed. So that meant that in various parts of the country, Black women couldn't vote. It also meant that women who were Native Americans, for example, who didn't gain citizenship rights until 1924, they couldn't vote yet. Asian American women couldn't vote until the 1940s. So this is not just a one size fits all, 19th Amendment passes, women are done, all women can vote. We can see this 19th Amendment moment as a much broader story in the development of women's voting rights over time.
Judy says, great presentation. Is there a way to see some of the pictures a bit bigger though? A link maybe. And I would just note, Judy, that I am going to send you a link to this presentation. So if you were to rewatch it, you could sort of zoom in a bit if you wanted. And then certainly if you purchase a copy of Allison's book, you'll have, I'm sure, what are great images. Allison, any other way folks can see the images you showed today?
So actually, if you look at the recording and then do a quick Google search for the images, a lot of the ones I use today are from the Library of Congress website. And so they're freely available. You can get like super beautiful high-res TIFF versions of them and zoom in very closely if you have the titles, which are on all of the slides.
Heidi says, great. And by the way, I will get to the questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to just hit the chat box, finish these up. Heidi says, great presentation. Thank you. I haven't seen your book yet. Do you cover the publication, The Suffragist, in it? Thank you.
Certainly. The Suffragist is an amazing publication. As you probably already know, Heidi, Nina Allender is another one of these early professional female artists who's pretty much the official artist of The Suffragist. So The Suffragist is in it. It's not, I won't promise you that it's like, there's like a chapter focused on the suffragist or anything, because there's so much wonderful imagery, but yes, The Suffragist was certainly an important piece.
Jane notes that we still can't get the ERA passed, Equal Rights Act passed, and that can be traced back all the way to the Seneca Falls Women's Conference in 1848. And further depressing news, P. Gran in the Q&A says, very interesting and informative. Sadly, here we go again with Jim Crow laws recently cited by President Biden regarding the new voting laws in Georgia. How upsetting. Okay, that'll just be a comment. Okay. Jessica says, love the presentation. What drew you to this research?
So just to kind of comment on the two kind of current events,
sure.
Notes that you both, that we had, which I love that you all made those connections. These are conversations that we're still having today about the Equal Rights Amendment, about who can vote in the United States. And we can see, you know, that the opposition to having access to the ballot for as many people as possible is really apparent in the 21st century, which gives us a sense of just how hard suffragists were fighting to gain the ballot in the past, right? I think that that's a really compelling thought. So when we're thinking about what drew me to this topic, you know, when I was looking at some suffrage images, and if you're interested in seeing some high-res images really up close, I would recommend doing a quick Google search for Library of Congress Women of Protest. There's an amazing collection called Women of Protest that has, you know, these digitized photographs of suffragists picking the White House, parading in Washington, D.C. And those photographs really stood out to me as really unusual, because they are for that time period. And I realized that no one had really considered why did they take these photographs? Why did they choose to do these protests? Why did the suffragists hire professional photography studios to come out and take these pictures? What was the goal? And while it started with this, you know, focus on the 1910s, what I realized quickly is that it's part of this much longer conversation about the ways we as Americans understand women in having political power. You know, what kinds of things are women allowed to do in American society, you know? So we're looking on the one hand in the 1910s at those suffragists picketing the White House. And at the same time in the 1910s, we're looking at these images of suffragists as good mothers and good wives, right? So we see this clash of ideologies of like what a woman in politics should look like. And it's kind of this strange clash, this challenging balancing act. And ultimately in the suffrage movement, this emphasis on women as good mothers and wives wins out with the kind of like, as far as dominant rhetoric goes. So as I said, I would argue those picketing suffragists were just as important by keeping the topic in the news and forcing Wilson and his colleagues to deal with it. But we still see today, a century later, a lot of women in public positions of power having to negotiate and emphasize that they are caring mothers and wives in addition to political figures. For example, most recently we have our first female vice president, and when she was selected, one of the things that she and journalists who wrote about her emphasized is that although she doesn't have children of her own, her stepchildren and her nieces call her Mamala, right? So there's this emphasis even then, and even in 2021, on her caregiving, her motherhood capacities. And it's certainly not just Kamala Harris that I'm thinking of who does this. We could think about a lot of other female politicians who are pressured to kind of both be these powerful political figures and caring motherly ones.
So folks, we'll take about 5 more minutes of questions. So this is officially the last call for questions. Judy has a very specific question. What was the nurse holding in the last photo that you showed?
That is a great question, and I can even just put it back on the screen so that you have a sense of it. So, and this is one that if you do a quick Google search for it, if you type in the greatest mother in the world and Library of Congress, you will be able to find a beautiful high-res image where you can, zoom in on your own screen if that's helpful for you. So she is actually holding a soldier on a stretcher. And one of the things that you can see here is that she's really similar to the representation of that Blanche James did of the mother and her children around her, right? It's kind of this, if you're familiar with Christian imagery, it's this mother, Virgin Mary and child pose that would have been very familiar to Americans in 1917. So this idea that she's the greatest mother in the world, she's giving up herself, she's sacrificing her own life in order to be a nurse and risk her own safety and care for these soldiers and be a patriotic citizen. So that is exactly what we have going on in this scene here.
We recently hosted Janice Newmara, who wrote a book called The Doctor's Blackwell. It's currently on the New York Times bestsellers list. And she writes about Emily and Elizabeth Blackwell, who are like two of the first female physicians in America. And what was really interesting is that both those women, despite their iconic status, they didn't consider themselves feminists, and they actually were against the women's suffrage movement. They felt that by giving women the right to vote, you're really giving the husband an extra vote. And I'm wondering if you encountered that in your research. Were there a lot of women who actually, for whatever reason, didn't want the right to vote? That just blows my mind.
That is actually most common. In fact, the anti-suffrage organizations were mostly run by women with exactly the same kinds of arguments that the Blackwell sisters made. They not only suggested that women would vote just like their husbands, that the state would be just having to pay more for elections and get the same results, that women should not want to leave their homes and should not participate in corrupt politics, that this was a masculine sphere and that women would become manly if they participated in politics, just as those political cartoons showed us. It was often women who were wealthier, who had more privilege, who had a little bit more informal power, the kind of women who perhaps had dinner with the mayor and her husband or something, rather than a woman who's working in a factory and has no kind of that same access to power. So the other thing that our audience might be interested to know is that the very first anti-suffrage association in the country was actually founded in Massachusetts in 1895. And so Massachusetts is not only known for being the center of pro-women's rights activism, it, fairly logically is early on a center for anti-women's rights activism. And we see this thread of conversation, not only among women and men, but of women and men on both sides, even about the Equal Rights Amendment much later in the 20th century and even in the 21st century. If you've seen the show Mrs. America, which is about Phyllis Schlafly and Gloria Steinem and many of the other figures from the 1960s and 70s, the Equal Rights Amendment advocacy, you see there, the later descendants of these early female anti-suffragists.
So let me get you out of here on this fun fact, because I don't see any more comments or questions, and it is 3 o'clock. But one of Tewksbury's claims to fame is this. And you may be aware of this, Allison, I'm not quite sure. But in 1915, Massachusetts men were asked to vote by referendum on women's suffrage as an amendment to the US Constitution. As in 1895, they took a similar vote 20 years prior. The referendum was once again defeated by Massachusetts voters. The only community in the state of Massachusetts to vote in favor of suffrage was Tewksbury, with a vote of 149 to 148. So by one vote, Tewksbury was the only municipality in Massachusetts to support women's suffrage. Statewide, the vote in favor was only 35.5%. So Tewksbury, over 100 years later, we're still patting ourselves on the back about that one. So Allison, do you have any last words for the group before we wrap up?
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for your thoughtful questions. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Great. So I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for co-sponsoring. I want to thank the Wilmington Memorial Library, North Andover Library, the Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover, and the Memorial Hall Library in Andover for partnering with us for this afternoon's program. And just a reminder to all the participants, check your email tomorrow at some point. You'll be receiving an email from me with a link to the recording of today's event and also a link to a feedback survey. Please take 30 seconds, fill that out. Let us know what you thought. So thank you, everyone. And I'm going to wrap up the call. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Have a good one, Allison.